When my husband Daniel passed away, the house did not cry the way people do. It didn't collapse or fall silent all at once. Instead, it became careful. The clock still ticked, but louder at night. The refrigerator hummed longer after shutting. Even the curtains seemed to move slower, as if the house itself was learning how to live with one less breath inside it. Daniel had always been the organized one, the kind of man who paid bills 2 weeks early and wrote dates on envelopes in neat handwriting. In the last year of his life, when sickness had already begun to thin his body, he became even more deliberate. One afternoon he sat me down at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the wood between us, and he explained everything as if he were teaching a child how to cross a busy road. He told me about the pension, the savings account, the insurance papers, the small emergency fund hidden behind old tax files. He spoke slowly, not because he thought I was incapable, but because he wanted every word to settle. "You won't ever need to beg anyone," he said gently. "Not even our son." I remember smiling then, brushing off the comment as unnecessary. Mothers don't imagine their children becoming strangers. They imagine them becoming busy, distant maybe, but never dangerous. When Daniel died 3 months later, I held on to his words like instructions written on my bones. I truly believed they would protect me. The first year alone passed quietly. Too quietly, some people said. Neighbors checked in, friends invited me over, relatives called more often than they ever had before. Everyone wanted to make sure I was doing okay, which usually meant asking whether I felt lonely. The truth was lonelier than they expected. I missed arguments about nothing. I missed hearing Daniel cough in the other room. I missed the weight of shared silence. But financially, I was fine. The pension arrived on time every month. I paid my bills myself, walked to the bank, kept receipts neatly filed. Independence felt like dignity. It gave me something solid to stand on while grief shifted beneath my feet. Ethan didn't visit much during that first year. Our relationship had always been polite rather than close. He was ambitious, restless, always chasing something better, something faster. When he married young and moved out of state, I told myself that distance was the price of raising a child who wanted more than a small, careful life. When his marriage collapsed 2 years later, the phone call came late at night. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. He didn't ask directly to come home. He circled the idea, talked about starting over, about needing time. When he finally arrived with one suitcase and tired eyes, I hugged him longer than necessary, partly out of love and partly out of relief. A house that listens too much welcomes noise. At first, his presence felt like a blessing. He fixed the leaky tap, replaced a broken light, carried groceries without being asked. At dinner, he asked how I was sleeping, whether I remembered to take my medication, whether the house felt too big for one person. These questions softened me. They sounded like care. Gradually, his concern shifted shape. He began asking about finances the way someone asks about the weather. Casually, frequently, without urgency. How much the pension paid. Whether it adjusted with inflation. Whether I still went to the bank alone. He framed everything as protection. "People your age get targeted," he said once, not looking at me directly. "People your age." I felt a small sting, but I ignored it. Love often requires small acts of blindness. One evening, he placed a folder on the table and said he could organize my paperwork better than I could. He spoke gently, patiently, the way Daniel used to when explaining something technical. I told myself that accepting help didn't mean surrendering control. That was the lie I needed in that moment. I handed him the folder. I didn't know I was also handing him access. Trust doesn't feel dramatic when it breaks. It feels administrative. The first crack appeared at the grocery store. The card declined. Once, then again. The cashier avoided my eyes, apologized softly, as if the mistake were hers. I paid in cash, my hands shaking more from embarrassment than fear. At home, I logged into my account, convinced it was a system error. The balance didn't make sense. It was too low, as if months had vanished. The pension deposit was missing. I called the bank, then the pension office. The woman on the phone spoke kindly, professionally, and confirmed that the payments had been redirected. When I asked who authorized the change, she said Ethan's name without hesitation. In that moment, something inside me went quiet. Not numb. Focused. I thanked her, hung up, and sat alone at the kitchen table until evening turned the room blue. I didn't confront him. That decision surprised even me. Instead, I watched. I noticed the new phone, the better shoes, the way he stopped offering to cover groceries. I listened to him talk about opportunities, about investments that promise quick returns. He sounded confident, almost proud. At dinner, I nodded, served him food, asked neutral questions. Silence can be a kind of preparation. I wasn't deciding whether to stop him. I was deciding how much truth he needed to lose before he could understand what he'd taken. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about Daniel's words. You won't ever need to beg anyone. I realized then that survival wasn't just about money. It was about restraint. And I chose mine carefully. Days passed without any dramatic confrontation. That was the hardest part for Ethan, though he didn't know it yet. Drama gives people something to push against, something to blame. Silence gives them only themselves. I continued my routine as if nothing had changed. I woke up early, made tea, sat by the window, watched the street wake up. Ethan slept late most mornings, exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. Not from work but from the constant mental strain of pretending control. When he did wake, he talked. He talked about markets, about timing, about how money moves if you know where to look. I listened without correcting him. Mothers are taught to speak when their children are wrong. I had learned that sometimes letting them finish was far more effective. The pension money continued flowing into the account he controlled. I knew this because I checked quietly, carefully, without leaving a trace of panic. Every deposit felt like a weight being placed somewhere I could not reach, but instead of rushing to reclaim it, I focused on observing what he did with it. Small purchases at first, then larger ones. Transfers labeled with names that meant nothing to me. It wasn't greed alone driving him. It was confidence. The dangerous kind that grows when someone believes they are smarter than consequences. I wondered, sometimes, where I had failed him. Then I remembered Daniel's words again, and reminded myself that adults make choices long after parents stop being responsible for them. The moment everything shifted came on an ordinary evening. No storm, no warning signs. Ethan came home earlier than usual, his face drained of color, his movements stiff, as if his body had already begun bracing for impact. He sat at the kitchen table without speaking. The silence stretched until it felt deliberate. Finally, he told me the investment had collapsed. Not slowed. Not delayed. Collapsed. The words fell flat, like they had been rehearsed too many times already. He said the market turned unexpectedly. He said partners pulled out. He said he would fix it. Then he stopped talking and waited for me to rescue him from his own sentences. I asked one question. Just one. I asked how much was left. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice barely held together. Almost nothing. That was when I told him I had no money. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply stated a fact. I reminded him that my pension had been redirected, that the account he controlled was empty, that there was nothing for me to give. His reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. He stared at me as if I had broken an unspoken agreement. As if mothers were supposed to be backup plans, endless and unconditional. That was the moment I saw the child in him give way to fear. I told him he could stay in the house, but not the way he had been. Things would change. He would work. He would contribute. Rent would be modest but non-negotiable. Food would be his responsibility. He looked at me then with something close to resentment. But desperation silences pride faster than reason ever could. He agreed because he had nowhere else to go. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because the situation had improved, but because it had become honest. Finding work humbled him quickly. Degrees don't matter much when urgency enters the room. He took the first job offered, overnight cleaning at a warehouse on the edge of town. Long hours. Heavy work. No respect attached to the uniform. He came home sore, frustrated, hands raw in a way they never had been before. At first he complained constantly. About the pay. About the supervisor. About how unfair it all was. I listened without responding. Complaints, like excuses, dissolve on their own when they receive no encouragement. Weeks passed. His body adjusted before his mind did. He began sleeping through the day, eating quietly, counting money carefully. I noticed the way he studied prices at the grocery store now. The way he paused before spending even small amounts. Once he asked if I had spare sugar. The question lingered between us longer than it should have. Scarcity teaches lessons abundance never will. One evening, he came home and said something that surprised me. He said money felt heavier now. He said earning it made him think differently about spending it. He didn't look at me when he said this. He didn't need to. The realization belonged to him alone. That was important. Lessons forced are forgotten. Lessons discovered are carried. All this time, he didn't know what I had done the day after learning the truth. I had reported the fraud. Quietly. Properly. The pension office froze the account, began recovery procedures. It took time. Bureaucracy always does. I waited. Not because I enjoyed watching him struggle, but because timing matters. Accountability without understanding only breeds bitterness. When the letter arrived confirming the recovery, I didn't open it immediately. I waited until I saw consistency in him. Until his work became routine rather than punishment. Until he stopped blaming others and started adjusting himself. Only then did I place the envelope on the table one evening and slide it toward him. He opened it slowly, confusion turning into shock. Every dollar accounted for. Safe. Returned. His hands shook as he read. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I told him the truth. Because he wouldn't have heard it. He cried then. Not loudly. Honestly. The kind of crying that happens when defenses finally collapse. He apologized without trying to explain himself. That mattered more than the words. He asked how he could repay me. I told him repayment wasn't just financial. It was behavioral. It was how he chose to live from now on. That night, I realized something important. Parenthood doesn't end when children grow up. It just changes its tools. And sometimes, love looks a lot like restraint. Time did not heal things between Ethan and me in the way people like to imagine healing happens. It didn't arrive suddenly, wrapped in forgiveness or relief. Instead, it crept in slowly, almost cautiously, like someone unsure whether they were welcome. After the night the truth was revealed, the house felt different. Not tense but alert. As if every room was paying attention now. Ethan became quieter, more deliberate in his movements. He woke up before leaving for work without slamming doors. Washed his cup immediately after using it. Folded his clothes instead of leaving them scattered across the chair. These were small changes, almost invisible, but they told me more than apologies ever could. People reveal their real understanding not through words, but through habits. He kept the warehouse job, even after his body adjusted to the exhaustion. There were days when I could see how deeply it drained him. His shoulders slumped more than they used to, his hands roughened. His sleep became heavy and dreamless. Yet he never complained the way he once had. When he did speak about work, it was factual, almost respectful. He talked about schedules, about overtime, about how much effort it took just to earn a modest paycheck. I listened quietly, recognizing the shift. The man who once believed money could be multiplied effortlessly now understood how slowly it actually grows. Our conversations changed shape too. They were no longer about ideas and shortcuts, but about reality. About planning meals for the week. About budgeting. About learning the difference between wants and needs. Sometimes, while sitting across from him at the kitchen table, I would catch him staring at the same spot where he once placed that folder of documents. His eyes would linger there as if the memory still sat on the wood. Guilt doesn't announce itself loudly. It waits. One evening, long after winter had given way to early spring, Ethan asked me if I ever resented him. The question came without warning, dropped gently into the quiet space between us. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because the truth deserved precision. I told him resentment was too simple a word. What I felt had been disappointment, fear, and finally clarity. I told him resentment implies helplessness, and I was never helpless. He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. That was another moment of growth. Understanding that consequences are not the same as cruelty. As weeks passed, I noticed him changing beyond responsibility. He became more patient with himself. Less defensive. When mistakes happened at work, he didn't look for excuses. He looked for corrections. Once, he admitted he had underestimated how much pressure his father had carried without ever showing it. That admission struck me deeply. Daniel had always been quiet in his sacrifices, steady in his presence. Hearing Ethan recognize that weight meant he was finally standing close enough to understand it. Eventually, the conversation about moving out surfaced naturally. There was no argument, no tension. Ethan said he felt ready. Ready to live with the consequences of his choices fully, without leaning on my presence as a buffer. We searched for apartments together. Not because he needed my approval, but because he valued my perspective. That distinction mattered. We discussed costs, long-term sustainability, the difference between affordability and comfort. He chose modestly, deliberately. Watching him sign the lease felt like watching a door close properly, not slam shut. The day he moved out was quieter than I expected. He packed carefully, labeling boxes, double-checking everything. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the house. The same house that had sheltered his worst decisions and his hardest lessons. He thanked me again, this time with steadiness rather than emotion. He said something that stayed with me, that the hardest part hadn't been losing the money, but losing the illusion that he could take without being changed by it. I hugged him then, not as a mother rescuing a child, but as a woman acknowledging another adult's growth. Life settled into a new rhythm after he left. The house returned to its earlier quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not heavy. Not listening for footsteps. It felt complete. I resumed my routines with more intention. I managed my finances personally again, checked statements carefully, asked questions when something didn't make sense. Trust, I had learned, should never replace awareness. It should walk alongside it. Ethan began repaying me month by month, even though the pension money had been recovered. I never asked him to. He insisted. He said repayment wasn't about restoring balance sheets, but restoring integrity. That mattered more to me than the amount. Each payment was a reminder that the lesson hadn't faded with time. Our relationship today is quieter, but stronger. We don't speak every day, and we don't need to. When we do talk, it's honest. He shares his plans cautiously now, with thought rather than excitement. He asks questions instead of assuming answers. I offer guidance only when asked. Boundaries, I've learned, protect relationships as much as they protect individuals. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit alone at the kitchen table and think about how close everything came to unraveling. About how easily love can be mistaken for permission. About how quickly silence can become either weakness or strength, depending on how it's used. I realize now that Daniel's greatest gift to me wasn't financial security alone. It was the confidence to stand still when everything urged me to react. Forgiveness didn't come as a declaration. It arrived gradually, through evidence, through consistency, through change. I forgave Ethan not because he apologized, but because he rebuilt himself in front of me without asking to be shielded from discomfort. That kind of transformation cannot be faked. Motherhood, people say, is endless sacrifice. But I believe it's something more complex. Sometimes it requires stepping back instead of stepping in. Sometimes love demands patience instead of protection. And sometimes, the greatest kindness you can offer your child is the dignity of consequences. The pension money rests safely now, untouched, but its real value was never financial. It was the clarity it forced into our lives. It showed me who my son was when temptation outweighed character, and who he could become when accountability took its place. It showed me that quiet strength often outlasts loud confrontation. The house still holds memories. It always will. But now, when it listens, it hears peace. And that peace tells me everything I need to know about the choice I made. The house changed again after that, but this time the change was gentle. It wasn't the sharp adjustment that came with betrayal, or the careful rebuilding that followed consequences. It was softer, like the kind of shift that happens when something broken finally settles into its new shape. Ethan came by often, but never unannounced. He knocked, even though he still had a key. That small habit told me everything I needed to know about who he had become. Respect, I had learned, often shows up in the quietest ways. We spent more time together without trying to define it. Sometimes we cooked in silence, moving around the kitchen without colliding, instinctively aware of each other's space. Other times we talked for hours about things that had nothing to do with money or mistakes. Books he was reading, people he worked with. The frustration of learning how slow progress really is. He laughed more easily now, but the laughter was different. Less careless. More grounded. It came from understanding rather than escape. One afternoon months later he asked if I wanted to visit his apartment. I agreed. It was small, sparsely furnished, but clean. Everything had a purpose. Nothing excessive. He showed me where he kept his budget pinned to the wall, handwritten, adjusted every month. He didn't do it to impress me. He did it because it mattered to him. Standing there, I realized something quietly important. He was no longer performing responsibility. He was living it. We sat on the edge of his couch drinking tea from mismatched mugs. At one point, he looked at me and said something I didn't expect. He said he used to think strength meant control. Control over outcomes, people, money. Now he understood that strength was being able to sit with uncertainty without trying to cheat it. That life couldn't be rushed without consequences collecting interest. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. He had already said what mattered. As the year moved forward, our roles settled naturally. I was no longer the protector, and he was no longer the dependent. We met each other as adults, shaped by shared history but no longer trapped by it. When he struggled, he didn't hide it. When he succeeded, he didn't exaggerate it. Balance had replaced pride. There were still moments of pain. Healing doesn't erase memory. It reshapes it. Sometimes, when I passed the drawer where the pension documents used to sit, I felt a faint tightening in my chest. Not anger. Just awareness. A reminder of how close love can come to being misused when boundaries dissolve. But the feeling never stayed long. It didn't need to. The lesson had already been absorbed. One evening, as autumn returned, Ethan invited me for dinner. He cooked carefully, nervously, checking recipes twice. The food wasn't perfect, but the effort was sincere. After we ate, he cleared the table and sat across from me with a seriousness I recognized. He said he wanted to thank me, not for the money, not for the shelter, but for not rescuing him. He said that if I had stepped in too soon, he would have learned nothing except entitlement. He said the hardest months of his life had also been the most honest ones. That was when I knew the story had reached its end. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. Growth doesn't announce itself. It simply stands there one day, undeniable. Later that night, alone in my house, I reflected on how easily this could have gone differently. How a single emotional decision could have preserved comfort at the cost of character. How many parents mistake protection for love, and how many children mistake access for trust. I realized that the line between generosity and damage is thinner than people like to admit. I thought about Daniel. About the quiet way he had planned for the future without trying to control it. About how he had trusted me not just with money, but with judgment. He had known I would choose restraint over reaction, even when it hurt, even when it cost me temporary closeness. That trust mattered more than any account balance. Time continued forward, as it always does. Ethan advanced at work, slowly but steadily. He enrolled in evening classes, not because he wanted status, but because he wanted understanding. He asked me for advice sometimes, and other times he made decisions without consulting me at all. Both felt right. Independence isn't distance. It's responsibility owned. Our relationship now lives in a quiet space of mutual respect. We don't avoid the past, but we don't live in it either. It exists behind us, informing us without controlling us. That's the healthiest place memory can occupy. I've learned that forgiveness isn't forgetting, and it isn't surrender. It's recognition. Recognition that people can change, but only when they are allowed to face the weight of who they've been. I forgave Ethan not because I had to, but because he earned the right to be forgiven through transformation. If there's a truth hidden inside this story, it's not about money. Money is only the surface. The real lesson lives deeper. Love without boundaries teaches nothing. Silence, when used wisely, can be louder than confrontation. And sometimes the most powerful thing a parent can do is step back and let life speak. The house still stands. The pension remains untouched. But neither of those things define the ending. The ending lives in the quiet certainty that came after the storm. The knowledge that what was broken did not destroy us, but rebuilt us differently. Better. Stronger. More honest. And when I sit alone now, listening to the house breathe around me, I no longer hear regret. I hear resolution. I hear peace. And I know without doubt that choosing patience over panic was the greatest act of love I ever gave my child.